All right, so let's just start as usual with a 10-minute meditation. We'll do surrender or self-inquiry, whatever you choose or whatever mix you choose. And let's start that now. All right. So anyone want to talk about their experience just now, or questions about the practice, or about anything related to the practice? Go for it.
Yeah, so I've been continuing to do more surrender throughout my kind of daily life because I guess like getting some context about it, I've come to realize that's something I was kind of discovering and was doing on my own anyways, and just didn't really know that was the name for it or that was
Mhm,
the particular prescribed thing to do.
mhm, mhm,
So I initially was trying to do a lot of self-inquiry, and like I talked about last time, it just felt a little um, I don't know, like it almost created agitation by doing that, whereas the surrender felt a little more natural with allowing
mhm,
things to flow.
mhm,
Anyways, so but this week, um, I guess I've kind of realized one, obviously it is a practice, right? So the more you do it, the better you get at it. So every thought, every emotion, everything you encounter is an opportunity to surrender, right? It is an opportunity to practice. It's all practice material.
Yes.
Um, and I've also noticed that the more I can let things go and the more just practices I do in general, to think about it as like my mind is like a pipe, right? The clearer and cleaner I can make that pipe, the more easily things flow through it, right? And so things are less likely to grab on, less attachments I have, less hooks are in the pipe to grab hair or whatever, is flowing through there.
Mhm, mhm, mhm,
Um, but I've also not had so since I was very, very young, one thing that I've always just dealt with is depression, like very intense depressive thoughts that will kind of just come uninvited and unexpected at times.
mhm,
And I had that happen to me this past week, which is something I've gotten a lot better at letting pass. Because years ago, I kind of had the realization that that was a thing that I wanted, right? That I was clinging to that emotional state, and that my clinging to it was causing it to stick around.
Okay.
And the experience I had recently was like it even though I felt like my pipe was pretty clean, it's still like just stuck. Like that emotional state occurred and passed, and I was felt like I was doing the same things I would normally do to surrender to let it go by, but it was just like this is a bit of a crude analogy, but the analogy that I thought of was like trying to flick a booger off your finger.
Mhm,
Like
mhm,
you go to flick it off and then you look and it's still there, and then you flick it with
mhm,
the other finger and now it's on the other finger, and like no matter how much you try to flick it away, it just keeps sticking.
mhm, mhm.
And that was my experience with these kind of like depressive thoughts this past week that it just stuck. I don't know if there's any, tips to kind of allow those things to flow more smoothly. And of course, it passed because it does, as all things do.
Yeah,
But it definitely created some, frustration and agitation for me because it felt sticky in a way that other things were not sticky, even
sure,
though I felt like I was pretty clean, if that makes
sure,
sense.
sure, sure. Yeah, well, so first of all, right, um, from the practice point of view, right, what surrender means, what inquiry means too, really is um, you aren't aiming for a particular feeling state. So when
Right,
you're asking for something to pass, which is what effectively you're asking, you're effectively saying, I want my practice to create peace,
right.
right? Um, versus surrender by the very word is saying, I'm allowing whatever it is to be. So if depression wants to stick around, let it stick around.
So rather than trying to surrender, I was trying to surrender the wrong thing, right? Like rather than trying to surrender the state away, I should have surrendered the desire for the state to go away.
Well, the surrender just means surrender. Right, surrender, to be clear, right? We're just saying, um, allow it to be. Don't get absorbed in it in the sense of do not forget the practice, basically, right? Because the practice of surrender is continuously saying, essentially, you don't have to say use the words, but it's the noticing that whatever is going on in your experience is not you and
Right,
is just an experience. And not therefore to ever lose sight of that fact, right? Because when we say become absorbed in something, it means to lose sight of the fact that this is merely an experience, right? So you're watching a movie, you get absorbed in the movie. What does that mean? During the absorption, you forget that you're sitting in the theater, right? You forget the fact that it's just a movie. You become absorbed in it. You
right.
take it to be real. So that sense of absorption, we're trying to prevent that sense of absorption. by continuously recognizing that this is just a play of light, this is a phenomenon, a mental phenomenon that's happening, and to keep that recognition continuously going so that you never take it to be truth.
So the
Yeah.
stickiness that's experienced isn't so much like my inability to allow that state to pass as it is like I that is the kind of thing I tend to get absorbed into
Well, yeah, sure.
and
Yeah,
like
totally.
and take to be real, which
That's
like that's
right.
something you know. I mean, maybe other people this way, but I've always suffering has always felt more real than other things for me.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, there's two levels of the way to look at it, right? So the very desire that something be not sticky
Right,
is itself problematic. So I'm trying to say, right? So that's not surrender, right? Because surrender is saying, so what? Something's sticking around, let it stick around, right?
right,
So this idea that it shouldn't be sticky, I I know you see that in various spiritual materials, and it can happen over time because attachments can weaken over time. Which means they will be less sticky. But but ironically, to weaken the attachments through the practice, one must detach oneself from the idea that certain negative experiences, painful experiences like depression, need to exit the mind immediately from the practice standpoint. From the
right,
practice standpoint, that's the case, right? Like, okay, so it's going to be here forever. Let it be. So what? It doesn't. This is not me. I'm not it. This doesn't define me. And also, I'm not using my willpower to act on whatever this depression is, right? This is to say, and really, what the depression is saying is fix me basically,
right,
right? So to use my willpower, to use what feels like my effort, my whatever feels like me to deal with it. Now that said, the other side of this coin, which is always relevant because you're talking about cleaning the pipe and whatnot, right? So I mean, the other aspect of the situation is, of course, to look at to change angles and look at it from a psychological standpoint, right? So from the pure practice standpoint, the pure practice is continuous surrender, which means continuous ignore this. It doesn't matter what's happening. It's all irrelevant. Let it be, let it not be, let it pass, let it not pass, let it stay, let it go. It doesn't matter what it is, whether it's positive or negative. The point is, it's all just color.
right,
Black, white, red, yellow, all color. And I'm not getting involved. Basically, that's what surrender is saying. But you know, uh, uh, what can happen is if you see, right, if you see, for example, that something like this depression is repeatedly and insistently interfering with your ability to do the practice in an uncontrollable way over time, then that would be a suggestion to deal with it at a different level, like for example, the psychological level. So that's why again, why I always bring up again and again and again something like psychoanalysis, right? Which is a specific kind of therapy. And so that's a possibility too, right? Because the reality is the practice is like a diamond tipped scalpel.
hmm
It does cut through anything eventually, and maybe it really never wears away actually. And you can in fact take down a mountain with it eventually. That said, it may not always be um, the easiest tool with which to deal with the situation. So where there are big psychological problems, and the reality is a lot of people, I mean, maybe the majority of people, or even the overwhelming majority of people have such issues one way or the other. Yeah, it might be wise to deal with them. So for you, if depression has been a problem in your life consistently, I do recommend to almost every seeker really, if they're willing to hear my advice, go get good therapy. Like, I mean, it's not necessarily accessible to everybody. I know there's complications, how to find the right person, how to pay for it, and all this stuff. But I'm just saying, there's nothing wrong with that, and that can in fact be the most effective way to deal with certain kinds of issues, which is why you have in the various traditions, right? Like in Vedanta, again, which I mentioned last time or the time before, various qualifications of a seeker, right? So, what are they assuming that someone approaching someone for spiritual instruction already has their mind in this fairly pure state, how was that achieved in the olden days, through tons of, various kinds of yogic disciplines and, various rituals were performed, with karma yoga as a background, and things like that, right? So that was their sort of their form of dealing with those issues. In the modern world, we have other ways of dealing with emotional issues. And the reality is that often they do need to be dealt with in that way because otherwise it'll interfere with your practice, in a consistent way. Again, if you can stick with the practice, yes, the practice can itself address the issue. The practice itself can cut through it, if you can. So
Right.
you'll see over time whether that's the case or not. But I just want to keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. So that's nothing wrong with that. So this idea, for example, that uh, how do I put it? Like what you said earlier, like I'm clinging to the idea of depression and that's why it's sticking around, right? That I'm attached to it. I wouldn't be so harsh on yourself because I don't think it's necessarily a matter of being able to wish it away, essentially, right? Or saying like, oh, I'm just going to detach myself from it and it's going to disappear.
Right.
It's not going to necessarily happen. What you can do is allow it to stay and say, okay, it doesn't matter that I feel depressed. I will continue to practice regardless. If you can do that, you can do that. But otherwise, it's sort of like saying, I don't know, like you're, let's say you're malnourished, okay? You're malnourished and you find it hard to do the practice under those circumstances. You're starving, let's say, right? Yeah, it's true. You can take the hunger that you're feeling and just surrender it, essentially, right? Say, I have nothing to do with this. But it might be wiser actually just to eat something. So,
Right.
because the reality is most people will not have the willpower, so to say, or the desire, really the desire, to be able to sustain the practice under those circumstances.
Right.
So, yeah. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, yeah. So
Just I guess
those two angles, yeah.
yeah, the two things, one to each point or one to each, level.
Mhm.
One just to the practice level. So because it is like we talked about last time, like it's this constant kind of game of remembrance, right? This like remember just constant like remembering, forgetting, and trying
Yes.
to retain the remembering as often as possible and
Yes.
recover it as quickly as possible when it's gone.
Yes.
And so on that level, the way I approached that was a moment of forgetting because the reason I was trying to surrender it so it could pass because I was comparing that state to some sort of conceptualization I have of what it would be to be free of that, right?
Yep. Yep.
Whereas ultimately there is no one surrendering, there is nobody even experiencing that state. And so like that was a moment of forgetting of what exactly it meant when that state arise or how to deal with it, right? On
Well,
some
I mean, so yeah. So I'll just pause you there for a quick second and say, look, when you're doing surrender, right? I mean, you know, um, yeah, in some sense, in some ultimate sense, nobody's surrendering. It's true, but um, uh, it's not really for that reason it's not exactly for that reason that I'm suggesting that you surrender the desire for this to pass. It's that ironically, um, like you said, your concept of what should happen when you surrender, which is namely a memory of peace,
right,
is actually interfering with the real way to get that peace.
right. That creates the tension, right?
That,
That
that,
disconnect
that
between my idea and my
between your idea and the reality.
moment.
That's what it
Yeah,
is. Because
yeah,
because ironically, to get to, in some sense, yeah, you do want to be free of the depression, or you do want to be free of the depression weighing on you. But in order for that to happen, one has to give up their idea of what that would look like
right,
and how that would occur, right? That's again, it's like going to sleep, right? So as long as you have the memory of what you think going to sleep is, and you try to achieve that memory, you're going to stay awake.
right.
Oh, I don't know why balloons are coming up now.
Yeah.
It's just agreeing with me, but so that's the issue, right? So ironically, to to get to the peace you're looking for, you have to accept the so-called non-peace, because the peace you're really looking for is not on the same level as the conflict.
Right.
Yeah, it's there's a relative level. I mean,
Right.
even anyway, this is a problem. Even when I'm saying
Like
that.
the peace and the depression would be on the same
Yeah,
level.
yeah,
And
exactly.
then there's something that
There's some
it's
underlying peace beneath
undercurrent beneath
both.
those things,
That's
right?
right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
and
That's right.
that is that moment of like
Yeah.
those subtle concepts, which the mind is so subtle with, where you begin to conceptualize or compare, and you don't even recognize that it's happening, and that's the falling asleep, you know.
Yes.
So that's the point to the practice thing of just like continuing that remembering, and I see that, I see how I did that, and then on the psychological level, and that's a thought I've had a lot because it affects me way less than it used to, and it affects me for a much shorter period of time than it used to because of the kind of change of perspective and the work that I've done with understanding how the mind works and how those things come and go.
Mm-hmm.
But I have always struggled a little bit with trying to understand the line between like an unhealthy detachment from those things and a healthy engagement with to reconcile those things because it does at some point. It feels like you could dig forever. I mean, you could, if I wanted to find things inside of me and reasons why I feel that way, I could dig forever. The mind would be endless. It would constantly create things for me to play with and to discover.
Sure.
And so like the line between going down that rabbit hole of like, ooh, okay, what can I find next versus I'm gonna just let go of it, but that letting go might prevent me from really dealing with something I need to deal with. Does that make
Yeah.
sense? Like
Yeah, that
how to
makes
tell
total
that
sense.
line between
So,
bypassing dealing with something appropriately.
right, right. No, exactly. So, yeah. So, I think well, I'll say two things. I want to say two things. One is, um, uh, it's not entirely about, just to be clear, about reasons. I know people think that way. I mean, because that's sort of like I'm looking inside for why I feel this way. It's not always in terms of uh finding reasons like that, especially because many of the reasons are unconscious.
Right.
So you can't find them even if you look for them, at least not by yourself. Um, Attached to that issue is that um, so it's not all about thought patterns. Often it's about you know uh, hardwired deficits in how people have been brought up. So, for example, during childhood, to just give a big generalization, right? If you haven't received certain important emotional provisions from your parents at the appropriate times, that can create damage. And
Right.
it's not exactly a reason or something in your thought process that causes then you to be depressed. It's that there's certain um, it's almost like a plant that's been starved of sunlight at an appropriate time or something. There's certain kind of deformations that occur, and so it's not about figuring out the reason so much in the usual sense as it is kind of trying to repair some of that damage. That's what, for example, good therapy does, just to be clear. But then you're right. So how do you determine when leaving the practice, so to say, and adopting deliberately this other perspective is required? And I think the answer is, well, my general answer is really, almost every seeker could benefit from therapy. But in a more case by case basis, is it repeatedly interfering with your practice in a way that you can't seem to overcome?
Right.
As simple as that, right? So if it is, then it's a sign that you need to adopt a different perspective. And I gave this example, in my uh my satsangs in Northern California a month or two ago. But there's a great example of a Zen master who was just meditating 18 hours a day, Hakuin, and and at a certain point he gets very ill essentially, and he goes to some senior monks, and they're like, well, this is meditation illness basically, and he has to step away from his practice, and he says so, to go seek out you know some kind of treatment for this, essentially. And he tells, in his writings, he's like, if this happens, you need to do that. That will actually support your practice in the long run. So yeah, sometimes it can be important because after all, the practice is itself a perspective, right? So the practice is, the practice is mirroring the absolute, but it's still a certain kind of perspective. It's relative practice because you're doing it. You're trying to do it as opposed to something else. So yeah, that's basically my guideline. Is you repeatedly interfering with the practice in a way that you can't seem to overcome, especially for reasons that you don't fully understand. Like it's happening and you're trying to deal with it and it just keeps coming up and you don't know why, or you're demotivated to deal with it, or you're like, I just can't. Something is blocking me. Something I can't see. Something I don't understand. That kind of feeling. Then I would suggest there's something psychological going on.
Okay. Because like I said, it is something that has lost a great deal of
Okay.
potency in the
Okay.
last years. And I think that's part of why it was so frustrating for me last week, is because it
Mhm.
just felt like this tidal wave that I hadn't felt in a long time.
Mhm.
It was this very, like I said, very sticky thing. But
Yeah.
the way we frame it from the practice perspective is really helpful to me of, yeah, like that is those subtle conceptualizations and memories I have or thoughts I have about what I should feel like, what it should look like to
Yes.
have
Yes.
that
Yes.
experience, or to, whatever, you know.
And another thing I'll mention, right, is the way the practice works, which is part of its beauty and its design is, um, it opens you up.
Mm.
And when you open yourself up, these things that are locked away do come surging up, and often they are unpleasant things.
Yep.
And it's good that they come up because then they can come up into the sunlight and be purified in light of the practice. But I wouldn't be surprised if as a result of deeper practice, you got in touch with more and more negativity actually, and things that you thought had lessened, at some level are still there.
Right.
But as long as you just, as long as if you can stick with the practice, then it will guide you through that.
And that's, I guess, kind of how I open this, in terms of every thought, every feeling is an opportunity to do that practice, right? As those heavier things come up, if
Yeah.
as lifting weights, like you lift heavier weights, you get
Yeah.
stronger.
Yeah.
Those are opportunities to continue to remember in the midst of in a more difficult moment,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
strengthen
Yeah.
that practice
Yeah.
overall, because
Exactly.
it's a heavier weight that you're lifting, essentially.
Exactly. It's sort of like at the very early days of when they invented movies, at the very beginning, um, uh, a train would come right at the screen and people would duck,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
under their seats, right? Because they're
Right.
so,
Sure. Yeah.
the same idea, right? So in the same way, right, more and more realistic or threatening phenomena occur, that are often rooted in your psychic life, your deep psyche. And yeah, it is an opportunity exactly to keep recognizing this is still on the screen. It doesn't matter if it's a fire, it's a tsunami, it's someone with a gun, effectively, right? It's all on the screen. None of it can touch you, right? No matter how close it seems, it can never touch you. And so it is sort of like practicing that in a way. It's like practicing, or like how they, how some therapies deal with phobias, which is to expose you progressively, right? You're afraid of spiders. Well, first we'll show you a picture of a spider, and then
Right.
we'll show you, here's a spider, 20 feet away from you. Now it's 10 feet away from you. Now it's 5 feet away from you. Now it's 1 foot away from you. Now we're going to put it on you,
Yeah.
and progressively you're going to see, well, okay, I'm not dying here, and you get, you're freed from that phobia eventually. So, yeah, yeah. So it is.
And I guess, also, from the perspective, like that is, those things arising is, I mean, the whole thing is grace, but or is grace, right? Because that
Yeah.
is that
Yes.
is that is something that ultimately I'm going to have to reckon with,
Yes.
right? On the way home, whatever we want to say. And so that is a thing that, and if that is appearing, that means that is, like I said, an opportunity, and that is grace, because
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
to deal
Oh,
with it.
exactly. I mean, these are the barriers, right? These are the barriers actually, right? So the vasanas, the tendencies in the mind, are constitutive of your identity as a person, and they act as binding ropes that prevent the seeker from penetrating the illusion. So in order for those ropes to be snapped, the attachments, often in the form, for example, of things like depression, have to arise, and they have to be, weakened through the practice. Yeah, because I mean, the depression is after it's linked to your identity as a person. The depression has a certain meaning. We don't know exactly what the meaning is for you in your particular case, but it does have a certain meaning, and that meaning is linked to, like, for example, it might be the case that depression, for example, it might guard someone against you know feeling internally separate from a parent or something like that. Like there's some connection to a parent. Maybe the parent was oppressed. The parent is gone now, and they feel depressed because that connects them with the parent. I'm just giving you an example of one of a million possibilities, right? So whatever symptom is there, it's connected to something. It's connected to some identity, some attachment, something.
Yeah.
And so so it has to. And those things keep you from the truth. Why? Because basically, the truth is always what feels incomprehensible and possibly like annihilation to the mind. So mind, which is attached to all of these things, including whatever the depression is connected to, is resisting the truth. So the depression has to arise, and one has to ignore it, and then it becomes clear that, okay, well, I'm not this, essentially.
When like I talked about with you last week, like the self-preservation instinct of the I that seems to kick in, right?
Yeah.
And it's going to pull the things that are most compelling to you. And that is like and like I said, that was kind of a realization I had, is that I did, even though I said I wanted to not be depressed, I was clinging to it for dear life, because it was all I knew. It was my identity. It was how I understood myself. It was like being in an abusive relationship with yourself on some level. Exactly. I know it's not good for me, but it's familiar, and it's my life, and it's comfortable because it's familiar.
Yeah.
And like I don't have that anymore, but I still think there's this subconscious part of me that knows, hey, if I throw this out there, it's gonna get his attention quickly. Because of that long history that we have together. Like you see an ex-girlfriend of 10 years at the mall, and you're like, oh, dang, man, that brings up some things in me. It's that kind of thing. So again, kind of understanding why exactly those things are arising and the opportunity available when they do. Yeah, cool. That's helpful.
Yeah, great. Also, I'll just say one more thing, because I forgot to say this earlier. So, we're talking about, you're saying every experience is an opportunity for surrender or for inquiry, which is very true. But I'll also just say, right, so I think you know this, but I just want to emphasize, we don't have to wait for new experiences to come to do the practice, right? Every moment is a new experience, even if it doesn't appear to be an experience, even if it doesn't appear to be something which is like causing inner conflict. It is still an experience, and our job is to keep it clearly seen as a phenomenon, because especially when there's no inner conflict, in those moments of essentially what would be relative peace, or depending, some variety of distraction. Either way, the point is, we should be proactively, continuously vigilant, not necessarily waiting for something to arise, but recognizing something is arising now. Something is always arising. So, and so with that attitude, again, Ramana Maharshi, I like this analogy a lot. He says, the mind of the realized person is like, it's like I forget exactly what word he uses, like, I think like a gyroscope, but essentially like a spinning top. It's continuously deflecting, whatever's currently happening.
Yeah.
So that continuity, we want continuity, proactive continuity, not just continuity when something arises, because
the nature of the illusion is forgetting.
Yes. Yeah,
I mean, that is what that is.
Right.
And so if you're not remembering, you're forgetting, right? If you're not diligently remembering, you are forgetting. Yeah. The thing I always thought about it as, like, I'm sitting in my house and I'm like, oh, I should go home. And like I walk out the front door and you get 5 miles down the street and you're like, wait, I was home. And then you walk all the way back. And like
Exactly.
the quicker you remember, eventually when you can touch the doorknob to leave, you're like, wait, what am I doing? I
Yeah,
know I'm
yeah, yeah,
right
yeah,
here,
yeah,
you
yeah,
know?
yeah, exactly.
But
Yes.
it's like the mind is constantly trying to walk out the door to go home. And you have to be like, no, man, we're already there. And like just redirect, redirect, redirect,
Yep, yep,
redirect.
yep,
But it is
yep,
so
yep, yep.
subtle and it happens
That's
so quickly that
that's
it's
exactly right.
very easy to, yeah, forget.
Yes, yes,
That
yes.
is
Exactly,
true.
exactly, right. So it's, someone is trying to lure you, again, like, yeah, I mean, I just want to I'll reemphasize, right? It is like, you're sitting comfortably in a chair and that's your job to sit in that chair.
Yeah.
And someone
Yeah.
just keeps trying to lure you out of the chair.
To do your job. You're
Do
like,
your
wait,
job to make you do
I was-
something. Exactly, to make you slave away and do something in the world, when in fact your actual nature is to relax and do nothing. So this is exactly what the Buddha had to encounter, right? The Buddha sat under the Bodhi tree for 3 days, sitting under the tree, right? And during those 3 days, the devil basically presents him with a series of temptations and fears, anything to get the Buddha to get up, essentially.
right.
And he resists them successfully. But the point being, just like you said, he didn't leave home, right? So to immediately intercept the second, right, at every moment, to keep recognizing whatever this is, whatever's happening, is some kind of temptation for
Yeah.
me to engage, you know, or for me to be absorbed into, to forget, like you said.
Right.
And so, yeah, exactly.
So I have a couple of questions from my practice. So one is how do you kind of know whether, like, so I had this situation, I think Akilesh, I've mentioned that to you.
Mhm,
So
mhm,
the the piece, like initially it went through, the, turmoil. And then after that, it was an opportunity for me to explore and practice. So now it has kind of, from this, very vigorous thing, it is,
mhm,
the wave is getting a little less,
mhm,
erratic. So how do we know whether it's just, they say time is a healer, right?
uh-huh,
Time versus practice.
uh-huh,
So that is one question. Second is, I've been poring over, listening to lectures and books and things like that. So um, I won't say my practice has been, there is the forgetfulness, that happens,
mhm,
but then there is something, there is the awareness that I have to keep coming back. So another tool, that came across from one of my readings was the separation between the I thought, which, is more a thought, right? The head, versus, bringing that I thought into, the heart, which is more, the feeling. So that analogy, I've been experimenting with that, and it seems to, maybe it's the equivalent of surrender. I'm not sure, so that is something that I've been reflecting on and experimenting with, so so that concept is something that I wanted some more clarity on.
mhm.
And the third piece is, is there a, way that whether you're making, incremental progress with the practice, or, so these are the three things, from, yeah.
Sure, sure, sure. So let me start with the third point first. I mean, the way to know if you're making incremental progress, progress with the practice is whether the practice is becoming more continuous over time. Whether you're able to do it in increasingly in situations maybe where you wouldn't have been able to do it before. Whether your desire for liberation is increasing, whether any of your attachments are decreasing. These are all very small. You're not going to see huge changes very quickly, but you can start to notice, oh yeah, I never used to do it in this situation. Now I am, that's different, um, for example, so that's I would say continuity to practice is probably the most important indicator of iterative progress. And then your first question was about time versus the
Time
practice.
versus practice. Yeah.
So what do you mean by that exactly?
Just the passage of time, the memory kind of weakens, right?
Yeah,
Memory of, whatever
sometimes.
feels,
Uh-huh.
intense and strong at a given point in time, right? I mean, so you go through all the so-called stages, and then with time, you kind of, maybe reach either memory weakens or you reach a point of acceptance, or I don't know,
Sure,
I'm just
sure.
going by, the time, factor. So both have happened, right? I mean, I've been kind of working on the practice and time has been passing, so all I know is, and again, it is a state, and I'm trying to work on sometimes when I feel more peace and, like just then, instead of settling in for that peace,
Yeah,
trying
good.
to say,
Uh-huh,
okay, what
uh-huh,
is it? Is it still a state of mind? And can the peace just get, so I've also
good.
gone through things like one day I'm feeling so peaceful and sattvic and everything. And the next day it's like, oh,
Sure.
who experienced that peace and sattva and everything. So now, it's, so I'm just trying to, see whether I should settle for a state of equanimity or even that has to be challenged.
Oh
And,
no,
so
even that
yeah.
has to be challenged because
Mhm.
remember what the goal of this game is, because we're playing a game here. The game is how can we penetrate the illusion that you're a limited person?
Mhm.
That's the game. And anything short of that is insufficient. So when we're doing surrender inquiry, what we're trying to do is we are trying to enter a continuous practice of discernment where we are continuously recognizing that whatever is going on is not us. And in that process of discernment, finer and finer and finer details, subtler and subtler and subtler shadings are continuously over time recognized as not me, not me, not me, not me, not me. And through this process of this discernment, eventually the structure that maintains the illusion collapses. But until that happens, the discernment must be maintained. So yes, it's insufficient to settle for any state of equanimity. And ironically, if you want to maintain equanimity for longer, you are best off subjecting whatever temporary state of equanimity is there to the practice. That will actually sustain the equanimity for longer rather than sinking into it. When you sink into the equanimity, that is to say, when you abandon the practice and allow yourself to be absorbed in a state of peace, you then expose the mind to vulnerability. Because at that moment, now you've forgotten, and now some new thought will come and hook you and take you, and then sooner, as soon as you know it, you'll be, whatever, 5 miles out to sea. So, so yeah, so you should continuously keep up the practice at all times. And yeah, I mean, so time can sometimes heal various emotional injuries, so can therapy and things like that. But remember, the practice is not necessarily to make your mind I mean, it will make your mind quiet over time. It will make your mind quiet over time. But at any particular moment or any particular span of time, like we were talking about with the depression question earlier, it's not about really the practice is not really about making your mind quieter per se. It's about recognizing that whatever noise is in the mind is irrelevant to you. That's the point, right? Because it's just like it's like on a TV, again, like on a TV, it could be, displaying a storm or volcano eruption, or it could be displaying, a blue sky and a green meadow. Either way, it's just an image on TV. So that from that angle, it doesn't matter what's on the TV. That's what we're trying to come to. So, to permit the mind to be upset, agitated, or whatever, but nevertheless to try to surf that wave, and recognize, okay, it doesn't matter. I'm not this. This isn't truth. This is just a hallucination, basically. So it doesn't matter that even if it's a nightmare, let it be a nightmare. I'm not in the nightmare. I cannot be affected by the nightmare. Now, this very process may, in fact, sometimes seem to result in the nightmare changing into a good dream, which is nice if that happens, but it need not. Just because that's the point. We don't need it to change into a nice dream. What we
Yeah,
want
except
is,
the attachment
Mhm.
to dwell on what feels peaceful.
Sure.
Right? I
Yeah.
mean, so you don't want to give up that state of, peace or equanimity, and so, obviously you want to run away from anywhere. The moment, a negative thought, so now that's what I'm noticing, increased alertness
Mhm.
for
Mhm.
anywhere, like if it's taking me, what I'm labeling as a wrong or negative direction versus thing. So every time my mind is escaping that way, like to be alert and keep bringing it back, keep
Yeah.
bringing it back,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Mhm.
dwell on. So in yoga, there is this whole thing of pratipaksha bhavana, so there is that part. And then I'm also attending the study group on Yoga Vashishta,
Mhm.
where and it's just chapter 2. It's a very small thing, and where they're getting into, there's a lot of thing on vasanas, and they call it, river of vasanas. And then, you can channelize it, the good vasanas versus the bad vasanas. And in Yoga Vashishta, they're talking about, like how, at least initially, it is about making the good vasana channel, more, like stronger. And
Yeah.
so there is this, right, bifurcation of what we construe as negative, that is causing more suffering, increasing
Yeah.
suffering and all those things, versus, like going towards something that reduces the suffering. So, yeah, I guess, we are still
That's
that
that's
stage.
that's like the division between what I was talking about earlier about between the psychological perspective and the pure spiritual perspective. So
Mhm,
so so
mhm,
when you're deciding I want to promote good tendencies and suppress the bad ones because the good ones promote
mhm,
well-being and the bad ones promote suffering, that's
mhm,
taking effectively like a psychological approach to the issue.
mm,
Which um uh, nothing wrong with that actually,
right.
and it's necessary and under certain circumstances anyhow. But from the pure spiritual perspective, um the point is all of these phenomena all of these phenomena are just phenomena, and in your attitude from surrender anyway, or inquiry, if you're doing inquiry, is who's experiencing them.
Mhm,
Who's experiencing them? Good vasana, bad vasana, doesn't matter. Who's experiencing them? Who wants to change them? Who
mhm,
wants to manage them? Who wants to get attached to a state of peace? Who's experiencing this peace right now?
mhm.
That continuous. So yeah, those are
Can
two
you
different.
elaborate,
Huh?
and then how do you, so when you keep asking that,
Mhm.
is it a question level, or is there,
Well, okay,
some,
so this is getting to your other question, which is which is
right,
which
the
is the
I
I
thought,
thought and the head and the heart.
exactly, and heart versus thought, right?
Yeah.
The moment you're
So
in the realm of thought, yeah. So,
so okay. So to be clear, right, the I thought it's not a normal thought like every other thought. It's a very
mhm,
special kind of thought. And
mhm,
so what happens is, we somehow seem to have this knowledge that we exist, right?
yeah.
Right.
Mhm,
This sense of I'm here-ness, I'm here right now. I'm aware right now. Like, oh yeah, I'm alive, whatever. These are all synonyms. What we're doing in self-inquiry is we're trying to localize that, find what that knowledge is.
mhm,
And the way we're doing it is we're trying to turn our attention towards it. Like whatever that it is, whatever that sense is, like what is that? Whatever that is that like gives us this um consciousness that we are conscious, our self-consciousness. What is it that whatever that is, because we're somehow knowing it somehow. And so we somehow know it, and we try to turn towards it, us, I, whatever it is that is in fact aware. I is trying to turn towards I. In the process of doing that, our attention goes to various objects that superficially seem like I, but then upon closer inspection could not possibly be I. Like, for example, you mentioned the head, right? So, okay, I is coming from here. So this is not the I thought. This is just a particular place or experience which has been mistaken for I, right? I feel like I'm in my head. Well, as soon as you think about that, from the rule of self, the main basic rule of self-inquiry is you cannot be what you're aware of. I'm aware of my head, or I'm aware of the sensation in my head that feels like me. So whatever that sensation is, I am aware of it. Therefore, I cannot be it, because if I were it, I would not be able to have a separate awareness of it, right? So, because when you look for that sense of existence, we're looking for what it is that is looking out through these instruments at whatever is. And so, or whatever seems to be anyway. So, so do you see what I'm saying? So, so whatever is in whatever this head feeling is, it's not I. It's not I. It's just a feeling that has been mistaken for I. So when we see that, oh, okay, well, I can't actually be this head feeling. This is not actually I. It felt like I, but now I realize it's something of which I'm aware, therefore it cannot be me. Then we continue the inquiry by saying, okay, well, what's aware of that? Or alternatively, we just go right back to the beginning and say, okay, well, again, knowing that I'm not in my head, where is my experience? And so you say, is it just a question? The question, I mean, and this is good. It's fun. It's this is the fundamental point, right, upon which inquiry hinges anyway, which we have to ask this question 1,000 times, which is, it's not, we're not asking a question really to think about it. The question is a prompt for attention. So
Oh, so it's the gyroscope. It gives you, so it just by asking that question, it makes it, less
it makes you
strong.
look for something. It's almost like, I mean, there's so many analogies, and unfortunately the practice itself will teach you really, but it's a direct thing, right? It's as if, for example, like suppose you had I don't know, you had what felt like a third arm, okay? And you're like, and you feel sensations of this third arm. You're like, oh, it feels cold sometimes, or itchy sometimes, or whatever. It feels like it's soft or smooth or whatever it is. And you're like, where are these sensations coming from? And you're like, I don't see it on my body, this third arm, but I'm feeling it somewhere. Like it must be coming from somewhere, right? Like, I mean, and so you're trying to hone in on what is this sensation that I'm getting, So when you ask the question, where is the sensation coming from? It's not really to just think about it. It's to pay attention to that facet of your experience, which is connected to that. So in the same way, there's this very special facet of our experience, which is the sense of being an experiencer, so to say. So what is that facet? Because that's the hidden facet, the underappreciated facet, the facet that's usually in the background, which we do not actually pay attention to, but is the condition for there being every other facet. So that facet, we're trying to like isolate it from all the other stuff that seems to be it, but isn't it. And so what is that in itself? That like that sense of the light by which all of this is appearing, like again, I'm trapped into using words to keep describing it, right? As if it were a concept, but it's really much more like a direct experience, right? Like again, like it's like, you're looking at, a rainbow and someone says, can you really, I want you to look at the rainbow very carefully and I want you to describe every color in it, like, it requires you to pay very close attention to the visual field to do that. So in the same way, you seem to have this sense of your own awareness. Can you pay attention to exactly what that is? What is that exactly? What is that? How do you know this, that you are, and then as you do that, you're like, yeah, it feels like I know this because I'm somehow in my head. Well, but then that can't be it, right? You see that because whatever that is just a concept
Mhm.
of which you're aware. So that the you that's aware of it, we're looking for that. The one who's aware of that concept cannot be that concept.
Right.
That makes sense?
Yeah. So along those lines, it just reminds me. So one of early morning in a more formal practice.
Mhm.
So like I have this early morning, so I do the yoga practice and then I do the self-inquiry in the formal, like so
Sure.
10 or 15 minutes.
Sure.
And so one morning, and it's still, I suddenly got this thing. Okay, when they say Sat, it was, a lot of clarity, Sat Chit Anand, right? Sat Chit Anand, that's what,
Mhm.
So suddenly this thought of, oh, this is what Sat, I mean, I felt as if I connected with what that Sat meant.
Mhm. Mhm.
I understand, now even that has to be challenged, but
Yes.
then it was like an aha moment, and obviously it's not replicatable, but then it's still,
Yes.
there in my memory.
Yes.
So, but is that real or is that also an illusion,
Well,
like,
it's
yeah.
it's what I'll call a glimpsey sensation. So,
Uh-huh.
so what happens is, when the mind is able to clear itself temporarily, and it could be as temporary as 1 second, it uh it can, for I like to say, like, it can go into a special mode essentially. That special mode is, you could call it, pure sattva if you want. It's a glimpsey mode. It's a mode of pure reflectivity. So in that pure reflectivity mode, which is still a mode of mind, it is still a state, but it's a special state. One apprehends the beautiful reflection of the self. But we do want to push that further. It's an accurate reflection, but so in that sense, it's true, but it's just a reflection. And in that sense, it's incomplete. Because what we want to know is, to whom is this reflection occurring? Whose reflection is this? Because when you say, I sat down, I did self-inquiry, and then the experience of sad or being became exquisitely clear to me, and that was amazing, right? The fact that it happened at a certain period of time and it had a beginning and an ending marks it off as an experience.
Mhm.
So yes, it is an accurate experience of a reflection of the truth, but it's still a reflection. So, in that sense, you want to know who's experiencing the sud. Because, like I say, our ultimate goal here is pierce through the illusion of self and find something which is permanent. This experience is not permanent because it came and went. So it is linked to the truth as a reflection of it, but it is not itself all of the truth. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so similarly, like with this idea of, like, so going, bringing the I thought into the heart and all that, I would say that rather than, because that can be misleading in the sense of it making people think that I have to somehow move some kind of sensation or something like that. It isn't moving a sensation. Just follow again and again and again that sense of your own existence, right?
Mm-hmm.
Find it, because once you see that it's not in my head, but then where is it? Because it is there somewhere. You are experiencing your own existence. You are knowing it somehow.
Mm-hmm.
So once you see it's not in this location, then, well, try to re-attend to it. Well, where am I then? Right? Because you somehow are, and you know it. And again, trying to lock in on that, like trying to sense your own sensation of knowing your own existence. Like, what is it? I mean, it is a mystery. It's right here, but as soon as you try to look for it, suddenly it's surprisingly elusive. You know, so this is the strangeness of it. You know, it's right here, but where? Right here, but where? Where's here? You know, so by repeating that, you will eventually, as the attachments begin, as you make this practice more continuous through your day-to-day, moment-to-moment lived experience, and as that practice meets the challenges of the attachments as they arise, you will be able to get deeper and deeper into the network of, you know, subtle views of yourself. And then through that network, eventually, you know, a tunnel will be found, so to say, because this I thought, which feels like something, right? It feels like a series of things. In fact, it'll feel like one thing and then another thing and then another thing. Through that feelings it is pursued, and then it turns out it doesn't actually feel like any of those things. Or alternatively, it feels like all of those things. But yeah, that is the actual heart to which you want, rather than any kind of notion of a physical heart or like my chest area or something like that, you know.
Yeah.
And so you talk about it's kind of a matter of attention, you know, like consistently and constantly redirecting attention.
Yes.
It's like that that special I thought it exists, like it depends on the shadows to exist on in some level, right? It's like the Wizard of Oz, right? Like don't look behind the curtain.
Yeah.
As long as you don't look behind the curtain, this thing can persist, and this idea we have of the Wizard of Oz can persist. But the second you pull the curtain back, it falls apart.
Yeah.
And so it's and that goes back to that self-preservation instinct that it works in distraction, because as long as you're distracted and not attending to the correct thing, it can persist as long as it wants to. But the second you direct that attention to the thing, it's in trouble because it's fundamentally unreal, and all you got to do is look at it to see that.
Yeah, exactly. Because it'll race. It'll like it's like it's like you know, like the light on the water or something like that. You know, as you pursue it, it races in front of you. You know, it races faster than you can go, basically. But it's okay, because your pursuit of it will suddenly reveal a different way of looking at the whole situation. You know, because I mean, after all, you know, like what you just said, this magic trick, which depends on distraction, you know, is itself nothing but the light of the self, actually.
Right.
You know, this magic trick is nothing but the light of itself. It's just that the magic trick is, you know, it manifests, quote unquote, in one way through, you can put it this way. It's not the absolute truth, but it manifests one way in this web of manifestation. And the only problem is that we view the manifested I, the reflected I, is what it is, as the only I. You know, we identify with a reflected I as if that's the only I, not realizing that that reflected I does not need manifestation to be.
Yeah, so it is a like perseverance game on some level too.
It is, of course, 100%.
Like,
It's a perseverance game. That is the most. That's why and perseverance is driven by desire, but desire is also fostered by perseverance. It's all cycle, you know, because you start out with a little bit, and then as both of you have mentioned, you know, you touch a little bit of peace, and you do want that peace. You are attached to that peace, even though you want to get back, you know, even though I'm suggesting you get past the relative piece to the absolute piece. Still, the relative piece is very important because it motivates, you know, and then you want more of it, and then you turn your attention a little bit more to the practice, and then in that process, you become less attached to external contingent sources of peace and more attached to the practice-based source of peace. And then, you know, slowly, that increases like a faster, and like a wheel going faster and faster and faster and faster. And eventually it breaks it breaks the attachments through that action, because eventually the desire for this piece becomes overwhelming and the desire for other things become weak. And through repeated glimpses, like that Sat experience, the mind learns to just trust. Eventually, the desire and the trust is established enough that it can surmount the, like you say, the sort of survival instinct of the mind. That I'm only here if in reflection, basically, right? So I can't let the reflection stop, because the reflection stop, I stop.
With something,
Yeah,
other thing has to be an association with some other thing.
Yeah, that's
But
right.
and those experiences are a double-edged sword on some level, because they can, like you said, generate more desire for the practice, but they're also like, that's the kind of stuff that I will just eat up for conceptualization purposes, right? But
Sure.
oh, we can do a lot with this thing. I can create all sorts of ideas with this thing, and this can distract us for a while.
Yes.
And that's where I guess
Yes.
remaining constantly attentive jumps in, because it's very like yeah, I'm a very Taoist, I guess, on some level, the way the mind works, right? It's like, whatever you give me, I'll use.
Yeah,
I got
yeah.
no preferences. Like, you give me that, I'll use your momentum against you. I'll use your weight against you. Because whatever you give me, I can find a way to turn into a distraction or turn into a concept.
Yes. But it's okay. I mean, in the end, right, the way the whole process works is we are going from many things to one thing, and then the one thing will extinguish itself, right? So we're talking about good vasanas and bad vasanas. Again, in a way, what the practice is doing is, yeah, we are giving the mind something to do. We're giving the mind this to do. Instead of doing 1,000 things, do this one thing, concentrate on this one thing. And yes, you become, there's a spiritual identity that's created, spiritual attachments that are created, attachments to various glimpsy phenomena are created, right? Egoism as like, I'm a great spiritual seeker is created. All of those kinds of things are created. It doesn't matter, because it's still superior to being engaged in the usual world. But then eventually the spiritual will fold in on itself, and it will burn those attachments out too. So, yeah, I mean, you're right. They are attachments, but they will extinguish themselves in time. You keep it in practice, and they will, again, like Ramana uses a very famous metaphor of the stick used to light, a funeral pyre that then burns itself up at the end, right? So the spiritual practice and its associated elements of identity and attachment, its own spiritual attachments, I mean, will burn everything else up, and then it will extinguish itself.
And then as the desire for liberation increases and becomes more singularly present, then you gain more clarity as to even how those good distractions or good attachments are holding you back.
Absolutely.
Because you become so one-sided. It's like, oh, I see how that's keeping me behind. Like, I don't need that more. No, thank you. I don't want that.
Yes.
Easier to go those things. Yeah.
That's right. Because it becomes exquisitely clear eventually over time how distraction by any thought, no matter how sublime the thought is strictly speaking inferior to the actual piece of the self. So once that's seen, then thoughts lose their power to compel in the same way.
So how do you, when this becomes, the main thing, now the other thing that I've been processing is, it also says while you're focused on, this practice, then, the role in the external world, I mean, I've been listening to the Nochur Venkatraman's talks and, all those things, and allow prarabdha, to take care of what your role is in the external world and all that. So I'm still trying to,
Sure,
understand that, because after being the architect of, you think you're the doer, and even the Bhagavad Gita and all say, right, give up doership and all that. So I'm still now, with this, I'm trying to figure out, okay, how do I let that unfold, or, or not? That's a wrong use. How do I let that already shows control, right? I mean, yeah, so I don't know how to frame that question.
No. But look, I mean, look, it's very simple. You keep your eye on the practice. If you're doing inquiry all the time, every single thought that you have, every single moment, in fact, that occurs, whether or not there's a so-called thought, you should treat as if it's a thought, and you're looking for I, right? So it's as if, in a way, I mean, it's not exactly the same thing, but it's a concentration practice, right? So it's as if, for example, you were I don't know, you were trying to remember something, okay, and it was extremely important that you remember this, okay. You know, someone's life or death could hang in the balance, let's say, whatever, right? What happens to all the stuff around you? It all just blurs, right? You might be walking along the street, people might be talking to you, maybe you'll talk back to them, but your mind is singularly focused on, I need to remember this. This is the only thing that matters, right? Everything else is just whatever. It just happens. It doesn't happen. It's irrelevant to you. I mean, in a way, that's what inquiry or surrender is doing, right? It's really more specifically, even it's specifically feeding it, actually. Anytime any thought of any decision comes up, right? For example, you can say, who's having this thought, right? Not what decision I should take, but who's having the thought that I need to make a decision. So in that sense, everything is dealt with. Does that make sense? Like at the very moment that it occurs to you that you have to enter the field of action in some way, at that moment, you should be practicing. And the practice will then save you from that issue.
Doership, from the doership.
From the doership, from any kind of doership. And your mind and body may still do something. In fact, even not doing something is doing something, right? I choose not to act. That's still an action. So, inevitably, the mind and the body will choose to do or not do, and whatever that choice is, the point is to not be focused on that, but to be focused on the practice.
I guess that's where, kind of letting go, or, shifting perspectives to a different level of, because, I guess where that tension comes in of where you feel like you need to engage is when you have this sense of what's right or wrong or good and bad or correct or incorrect in terms of my action in a particular situation.
Yes.
But if I can step back and, again, keep my attention on the practice and understand that whatever happens, and there is no really good or bad to that, I guess, on some level, then I can just there can be some freedom to allowing that to unfold without feeling like you have to do the right thing, or interact in the correct way.
I mean, look, to be clear, right? So again, when we're surrendering or inquiring, we're not putting conditions on what the mind has in it. So the mind can go through its own long sequence of reasoning about something, and it can do that without you. So, for example, it can be considering an issue like, oh, should I, make this choice or that choice? And then it might be drawing up, its own list of pros and cons and considering this and that consideration and looking at its emotions and judging, yes, I don't want this to happen. I want that to happen. That entire stream of thought can be ignored.
But, okay. All right. That's, yeah. So the action that is taken may still occur as a result of that mental process.
Yes.
You're just not.
Yes.
You're identifying with that mental process.
Exactly.
That mental process is still occurring because there has to be some movement to action, right? Like there has to be something that precedes the action.
Sure. I mean, right.
You just aren't necessarily involving yourself with that process, but that process will still unfold.
That's correct. Exactly. So precisely. So we don't have to put limits on what the mind is doing or not doing, feeling or not feeling, thinking or not thinking. We can view the mind and all its thoughts and its emotions as just as external as the clouds. Like, okay, we look at the window, there are clouds moving. Well, similarly, we look at the mind and there are thoughts moving, there are emotions moving. Now, it might be the case that, as you do the practice over time, that the mind does appear to alter its patterns, and that's great. We want that to happen. It's nice if it happens, but it isn't strictly speaking required. And the point is not to insist that, oh, if I'm doing the practice, that means that the mind has to have these certain attitudes, because it may not always be so. And we don't want to get involved. We don't want to get sort of drawn into insisting that our mind have a certain quote unquote spiritual attitude towards life.
So
Which is
the,
different. Yeah.
the indicator of progress isn't the way in which those processes unfold or the way in which the mental thoughts precede the actions. The progress is indicated by how, I guess, agitated or involved you are in those processes that go on. Right.
I mean, the issue is whether or not you identified whatever that means, which is itself, you know, it's itself a trick word, right? Because what is identification exactly? That's what we're looking at. Because the reality is again, the mind can, technically speaking, be as agitated as it likes. It is also part of the TV screen. So, you know, technically speaking, it can be as agitated as it likes.
Or unagitated about that process, right?
Exactly. It
can
be
agitated about the process or unagitated about the process also is just.
That's right. That's exactly right. So I mean, you could ask yourself, and it would be an interesting question. So what exactly is at peace here?
Right.
Right? Because if we're saying the mind can be agitated, you know, what exactly is at peace here? And the answer is, well, you're at peace, but who are you in this picture, right? That's what inquiry is looking at. That's what surrender is looking at. Remember, inquiry and surrender are really doing very similar things, right? They're just sides of a coin. In both cases, what we're trying to see is that there is something which is not contained by the changing phenomena. So the changing phenomena can be whatever they are. They can be in the mind, they can be physical, they can be emotional, they can be imaginary, they can be memory, whatever they are, right? Whatever they are not totally definitive of you. That's what we want to, that there's something beyond that, no matter what, right? And that which goes in and through both agitated and peaceful thoughts, both waking and sleep, right? That through all the opposites, and is what it is in all situations regardless, so much so that it can't even be called an object, right? We're trying to find that, and we can't find that itself. We can only destroy the barriers to the recognition of that, in a sense, because it's not a thing. So if it were a thing, then it would have limits, it would have boundaries, and then it could be found, but it can't be found in the usual sense because we are it. So, you know, but we can destroy the boundaries to whatever this false identification is.
Yeah. So, you know, the which I've seen that before, that, you know, if I am agitated or there's a specific emotional state, there is the thing that knows I'm agitated isn't agitated.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
But there is a baseline there, or whatever you want to use, that isn't agitated and it isn't peaceful.
Yes, precisely. It's just like it
has no characteristics.
It's no characteristics. Exactly. Right. Exactly. But it has the characteristic of being, in some sense, accommodating of all characteristics.
Being pervasive through all, or present through all.
Just like space, right? Like literally just space, right? Space can permit, you know, an explosion, or it can permit, you know, like total stillness, and it is space in either case. You know, it's just permitting. It's permitting itself unaltered, whatever seems to occur within it. You know, even that, right? We should be careful, right? Every metaphor, I say space, every sud, being, these are all metaphors. All the metaphors are themselves traps, because the traps are, because they're ideas, and ideas are reflections, and whatever this is not just a reflection. So, you know, we want to simultaneously recognize the validity and utility of these ideas and metaphors, while at the same time recognizing they're just metaphors.
When in the same way, I guess, you know, we have, on one level, there are good and bad attachments, right? Ones that bring us closer or farther away. But then on the other level, they all have to go ultimately. I can choose to identify myself with that undercurrent that is present within the agitation and within the peace.
Yes.
But that is also an identification that can become a trap that I have to let go of. But on another level, that is a more useful identification for the practice than the identification with the agitation.
100%. Exactly.
So
exactly right.
So just continue to identify with that, and then holding that loosely, knowing that that identification is also just a falsehood that the I is using to be like, oh, I'm this now. Okay, cool.
That's right.
I'll be this as long as you want me to be this, as long as I can be something.
Exactly. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So because you want to question that too, right? That exactly. And but that's why I've been holding the practice, because the practice itself is what drills down through all identifications, and it will eventually drill down through that identification too, right? Because you're exactly right. That's the process. Process is we have all the stuff in the foreground, and there's a so-called background, and then we try to shift identification through the practice from the foreground, well, from superficial layers of the foreground to increasingly deeper layers of the foreground, and then eventually, quote unquote, to a background. And then eventually the background will show itself to be part of the foreground, you know, that there's something beneath both background and foreground that is neither background nor foreground, you know, and it's something with which you can identify, because the one who identifies is itself part of the foreground. So, you know, it's like a snake eating its own tail. Yeah. And with that, it's time to conclude. Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Appreciate it, man.
Bye.
Bye.